what are the key takeaways from this midterm? We're joined now to talk this through with David Sirota, founder and editor over at Lever News. David, first of all, congratulations on the shroom psilocybin victory out in Colorado. And what's up with Lauren Boebert? Is she? This will run over the weekend, so you can be called out for being right or wrong. Looks like she's going down, but what are people saying?
I mean, it's very, very close, obviously. I think it's within 65 votes right when we're talking right now, which is incredible. The votes, I think, are still coming in from Pueblo, which has been one of the sort of swingiest parts of Colorado for a really long time, kind of considered what we used to call the Ohio of Colorado, although Ohio is not really a swing state anymore. But, it's anybody's guess at that level how close it is. And, I'm waiting to see how conspiratorial the Boebert campaign will be, whether this ends up being a kind of cause celeb of the right to try to call into question the results and the counting of votes. I feel like it's spring-loaded for that.
Are you seeing any of that yet? Like, were there?
I haven't seen any of that. No, I haven't seen any of that yet, which is actually somewhat surprising, and I've been paying attention pretty closely. But I have to believe if there is a declared winner, that will start. I mean, there will almost certainly be a recount of the votes, almost certainly. And I think at that point, when you can do curing of ballots, where you can go out and you can, you can challenge signatures and make sure that signatures are right and that's where it can really, truly get into that territory.
That's what I was thinking.
The signature thing is so dumb. I don't do the same signature ever, twice. So for your first takeaway in this analysis that you guys have out at Lever News, that the economic populism formula works in swing states. In swing states. So you had this fascinating case where the 2006-2008 blue dog kind of approach to swing states wasn't really replicated. So Pennsylvania being a great example. You had a 2006 era Democrat in the primary in the form of Connor Lamb, and he was roundly rejected by the Pennsylvania primary voters on the Democratic side. And then you instantly heard from a lot of people, oh, Fetterman's too progressive. We just threw this away. He had a stroke right before the primary, still ended up beating Dr. Oz. So beyond not just Pennsylvania, what's the evidence that this new approach was actually successful at the ballot box?
Sure. Well, I mean, again, let's start with the middle of Pennsylvania. This is the key part. We're not talking about Philadelphia or really Pittsburgh. We're talking about how do you overperform in the red areas of industrial states, swing states, and the like. And the key is that Josh Shapiro, the gubernatorial nominee, has told me for a long time, I've known him for a long time, he said, it's not just about winning Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, it's also about not losing so much, not losing by such big margins in the conservative, more traditionally Republican areas of the state. And when you look at Pennsylvania as one example of a couple, John Fetterman significantly overperformed Joe Biden from 2020, specifically in those traditionally Republican areas. And he did that, I think, in part by casting himself as a kind of pro-worker, pro-$15 minimum wage, economic populist, focused on economic working class issues. Same thing, by the way, for Shapiro. That also translated, I think, in part to Chris Deluzio in the other very contested House race there. Same thing for Summer Lee, by the way, in that contested House race. But look at Ohio. Tim Ryan ran almost exclusively focused on kind of a pro-worker agenda, talking a lot about trade, a lot about wages and the like. He also significantly overperformed in the more traditionally Republican areas of Ohio. Now, he didn't win because Ohio is a redder state. Out here in Colorado, Michael Bennet, not exactly in the past known as much of an economic populist. He actually went on record and said, when I first got to the Senate, I didn't really realize how much economic inequality was a problem in America. And in this race, he campaigned, one of the few of Senate candidates who campaigned explicitly on economic issues, his advocacy for the child tax credit. And again, he overperformed not just across the state, but overperformed specifically in those Republican areas. Now, it's hard to make an exact connection, one-to-one connection, but we do know that some of the more conservative Democratic Senate candidates, like Catherine Masto in Nevada, like Franken in Iowa and the like, did not overperform, have Democratic overperformance in those traditionally Republican areas. So I think there is something to the idea that having a profile as a pro-working class Democrat, economic populist, has some benefits specifically in those areas that are hardest to win.
Yeah, especially if you're able to put that foot forward and like keep that front and center of the campaign, focus of the campaign. I think that's really interesting. I want to ask, this article is super rich with food for thought for people. There's two that I wanted to ask you to unpack. David, climate action for the win, and the other one is the student loan debt cancellation, and how those may have helped people, helped Democrats, maybe nationally, maybe on particular tickets. What evidence suggests that those really were things that helped sort of stave off a red wave?
Well, on the climate thing, what's really incredible is that the Republicans never actually tried to make it an issue in a negative way, the Inflation Reduction Act and the like. They didn't touch climate. Now, to be clear, the Democrats in their messaging, according to the ad data, also didn't touch the climate issue. It's kind of sad. We're living through a climate emergency, obviously. Polls show, by the way, that more than half of the country the exit polls saying that they're worried about climate, the effects of climate change on their communities, just not really a part of the discourse. But here's the point. The fact that the Republicans didn't try to hammer the Democrats on climate issues in the wake of the Inflation Reduction Act suggests that somewhere in that party they realized that's not a winning issue. So I guess the point there is that climate and doing good things on climate was not politically toxic for the Democratic Party. Now, on student debt, I think that's a pretty straightforward story as well. I think you saw a boost in the percentage of people under 29 voting for Democrats. I think it was a 5-point boost by CNN's exit poll. In other words, Democrats winning that age group by more than 5% than they had in previous elections. And that came in the wake of the student debt cancellation. Now, there was all this talk that student debt cancellation, from conservatives saying that not only is it bad policy, it's supposedly, and the corporate media sort of said this, it's bad politics. That proved not to be the case. There is a strong argument to be made that helped boost Democratic numbers, especially, it's worth adding, Biden's numbers among young people heading into this past summer were not good. There was a lot of dissatisfaction with him. Then he did the student debt cancellation, and now we have an election in which young voters really were the voting bloc that delivered the election in the sense of staving off that red wave for Democrats.
I want to get into your inflation analysis too, which I think is interesting on a number of different levels. One, and you headline it that many voters didn't buy the inflation lie, but what you mean, I think, is that a lot of them didn't pin it on Biden in particular, or believe that it equaled like a devastated economy. You cite a poll, Fox News voter analysis, pre-election poll saying 54% of Americans believe that inflation is a result of Biden's policies, but 46% said factors outside of Biden's control were responsible, which itself is fascinating. And then you also highlighted this interesting Morgan Stanley analysis that just came out. And we actually mentioned this earlier on the show on Thursday. The memo said that the results undercut the notion that inflation is an electoral liability for the Democrats. The memo added, investors could see this result as permission for the party to ease the political and legislative constraints that kept Congress from enacting some of the fiscally expansionary policies that were part of President Biden's original Build Back Better agenda. Of course, they can't do that if they don't control the House. But what did anything about the election change your view of how inflation and the economy were factoring in?
Well, I think, look, Larry Summers, Jason Furman, and all throughout the kind of elite media and business press for months has been trying to argue that the Biden administration's spending, the American Rescue Plan in particular, created the inflation crisis. Now, after all of that, and the Republicans sort of also arguing that in millions and millions of dollars worth of ads, after all of that, they fought it to 56% of the country bought some part of that argument. But 40+% of the country said absolutely no, that they don't buy that. And I think the point is that that's a big loss for those who were making the argument, a big political loss, when so much money and kind of attention went into trying to burn that idea into the country's mind. And it really, the fact that it's nearly split, 46% of the country saying no, I think was a huge loss for that side of the argument. And I think that is a huge part of why we have the results we have. And I do think Morgan Stanley is right. It basically says, listen, the public is not buying the idea that helping people, with whether it's $2,000 checks or anything like that, that helping people is the driver of inflation. And I think, we're going to see if the Democrats narrowly end up controlling Congress, there is sort of a what do we do now kind of situation, because I don't think they were expecting to win Congress with Biden in power. So there is kind of like a what are they supposed to do now? And I think these results should say, listen, if you were thinking about doing things like the American Rescue Plan that were popular at the time and voters did not punish you for it, did not connect it to inflation, rightly so, then they should do more of that.
It's interesting because it forces the sort of conversation about whether voters did care about that, but were terrified of the Republican candidates more than they cared about that. And that's sort of
can I add there? Let me add to that. The Republicans did not make any kind of coherent argument about inflation. I mean, I was wondering about this for a long time. Oftentimes you've seen in the past, the Republicans make a criticism and then say they would do X or Y differently. We saw a campaign, I think, where the Republicans complained a lot about inflation. I saw this tweet at one point. I think it was the Republican senator from Indiana, just tweeted a picture of himself at a gas pump, right? Just as complaining about it. But there was no here's what I'm going to do. Here's what we should do. It's just him being angry at a gas pump. And I think not fleshing out, not even trying to flesh out any idea of what the Republicans would actually do, I think was a big problem for the Republicans, because sure, they can criticize inflation, but when voters, a lot of voters, when they decided who to vote for, it wasn't like the Republicans were presenting an alternative. They were only presenting a complaint.
Yeah, and I think the alternative that they sort of were presenting in certain cases, if you look like Tim Michaels in Wisconsin, is horrifying to so many people that it brought them to vote, or Mastriano brought them to vote in a different way. Or you just have a terrible candidate, Dr. Oz. It's well, what's this guy going to do for me? Where you see Fetterman's gains in Erie County, for instance, David, to your point, it's a little bit of both. I think the Republicans really failed so much to be proactive on that message.
And they really could have hammered the antitrust message there.
But you can't do that with Dr. Oz.
Right, Dr. Oz. Right. And actually, and David, this would resonate with you too. I got family in Allentown, a bunch in Bucks County, and every time I'd go to visit them over the past year or so, just because I would drive up and then across 83, but driving through there and also, or being in Kutztown or Allentown, the idea that this is Dr. Oz country was just laughable.
I know. I mean, look, the candidate selection across the country for the Republicans, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, they really picked some not just sort of toxic candidates, certainly, but also just candidates who didn't really seem all that in touch with what's going on. I mean, I will tell you from out here in Colorado, Michael Bennet won that Senate race here pretty handily, and Colorado has become a real blue state in a real way, at least right now. But the one thing that I think probably frightens a lot of Democrats out here, Democratic operatives and the like, is that for the first time in a long time, the Republican primary for Senate produced, and I'm putting in quotes, a kind of normal-seeming candidate, Joe O'Dea, kind of, regular guy-seeming candidate who was not a big firebrand. Now, he lost. But I think what scares some Democratic operatives is if the Republican primary in a place like Colorado starts producing more normal-seeming candidates in the Glenn Youngkin mold, that could be a problem for the party long-term. Now, I'm not sure the Republican primary across the country, those primaries, will start producing those candidates. But I think they had a test here in this election of producing very extreme-seeming candidates, and it didn't go well. And if the primaries for the Republicans can start producing candidates who have almost the same kind of policies but present a little bit more normal, if you will. I think that is the thing that should scare Democrats, because right now they really are benefiting from, the Democrats are, and they are really relying on the Republican primaries producing these kinds of monstrous comic book supervillain candidates. And I think ultimately, whether or not the Republicans can figure out how to produce candidates that don't look like that, that'll be a big question for their success or failure moving forward.
And so Democrats have helped them do that too. And I think you can still criticize it on an ethical ground, but I think they helped. I think 6 MAGA candidates get through primaries.
That's a lot.
And all 6 of them lost by double digits.
I mean, that is really playing with fire. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Like Democrats sort of preferencing or helping and sort of subtly boosting the most extreme candidates. You really got to know what you're doing, because if something goes wrong, you can end up helping get those candidates nominated, and then they can actually win the elections. But I think, what I worry about is that the Democrats take what happened in this election and do more of that, play with fire more. And ultimately, at some point, just the odds would tell you that at some point that's going to go wrong.
Yeah, every Democrat wanted to run against Trump in 2016. They wanted Hillary to run against Donald Trump. And unless you really know what you're doing, unless you really understand where the electorate is, you can go wrong very quickly.
It's like the Germans' very clever plan to send Lenin into Russia so they can get him out of World War I. This will be fine. And then 30 years later, Soviet Union's occupying East Germany. Whoops.
So close.
Ask Saudi Arabia how well it went, like boosting Al-Qaeda.
Right. Yeah. Well, Saudi Arabia, anybody else that might have boosted Al-Qaeda. Yeah. David Sirota, thank you so much for joining us, as always.
Thanks to both of you.
Absolutely.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.